March 15th marks International Day to Combat Islamophobia. The day of observance designated by the United Nations highlights the, quote, rising tide of anti-Muslim hate. It's a reality Canada's first special representative on combating Islamophobia is aware of. Amira El-Gawabi joins us now. Amira, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Faiza.
So there has been a global pledge to combat Islamophobia, and for years now. I'm wondering what the current situation is in Canada right now, and if this is still a persistent problem.
Unfortunately, the answer is yes, it is a persistent problem. In fact, what we've seen over the past few months, since the beginning of the Gaza-Israel war, is that you have a situation where we see sort of the online hate. So we've seen an increase of 422% increase in online Islamophobic hate registered in the first few months of that conflict starting. And then you have the spillover effect into real life, where we have a series of attacks of Muslim individuals, often Muslim women, because there's a gendered aspect to Islamophobia. We have vandalism at mosques, at apartment buildings where Muslims live. We have all sorts of incidents and indeed hate crimes targeting our communities, given what the climate is right now. So it is rather unfortunate to have to note that indeed Islamophobia not only is not, being fully combated, but in essence is in fact increasing.
And what's concerning is that you hear a lot of the wording happening online, whether it's on social media or whatnot, and how it manifests in real life. In some cases, these are words that later turn into violence. I'm wondering, what are the impacts of Islamophobia on communities?
Well, we just saw the decision in the sentencing hearing of the perpetrator, the terrorist, in the attack on the Afzal family in London, Ontario, where through what we learned about that terrorist, that he had been consuming anti-Muslim hate online, that he had been looking at far-right ideologies around immigrants, Muslims, etc., many groups, and that he took those attitudes and that was what informed and used in his reasoning for why he would specifically target an innocent family out for an evening walk back in June 2021. And this is not the first time. Of course, in Quebec City, we saw similarly a murderer walk into a mosque based on his ideas and fears of Muslims, again, coming from the types of narratives and commentary that we find online from far-right commentators, from certain politicians even, who really feed into this notion that Muslims are different, they're other, they don't fit in, they don't belong, and therefore justify the type of violence or hatred that can impact them.
Here in Toronto, we've had Toronto police talking about the increase of hate crimes in recent months, among them targeting the Muslim community. But some Muslim organizations, including the National Council of Canadian Muslims, are also quick to point out that this is something that's underreported. Why is that?
Well, what we've heard from Statistics Canada is there is something called the dark figure of hate crimes. And that basically means there's a whole swath of Canadians who have told Stats Canada through various surveys over the years that they do not report the hate crimes they experience, whatever community, whether it's Muslim, Jewish, other communities as well. So whatever numbers that we're looking at, which do sort of paint a picture, kind of give us a tip of the iceberg of what's happening, the reality is up to 80% of victims do not report to police. So we don't fully understand what is happening. I'll give you a quick example, Faiza. A young 15-year-old girl out in Halifax recently was waiting for public transit, and an individual, saw her wearing her hijab and spat on her, and said very harmful, very, very hateful things to her. She did not even realize that she just experienced an assault with a hate motivation. She didn't think of reporting it to police, and it wasn't until she spoke to a counselor at her local mosque who said, no, this is a hate crime, you better report, and she did. So just to give you an idea that there are many of these types of incidents, sadly, that occur, particularly given the climate that we're in, where we see sort of this type of incident happening, and yet it doesn't necessarily make it to the radar of our law enforcement.
And Amir, last question real quickly. We have about 30 seconds or so. I'm wondering on this International Day to Combat Islamophobia, what's been Canada's commitment to tackling this issue and just how much work needs to be done here?
Well, I think what's important is that Canadians right across the country have demonstrated their commitment to standing up for Islamophobia. So it is up to not only the federal government, the work that we're doing in our office, but also fellow Canadians to really come together and collectively say, you know what, Canada is undermined by any form of hate, whether it's Islamophobia, anti Semitism, anti Black racism, anti Asian racism. Sadly, the list goes on. And so all of us have a responsibility to call on our politicians and our elected leaders and officials to commit to addressing this. So the federal government has an anti-racism strategy. It has a action plan to combat hate that will be unveiled soon, and has recently presented legislation on online hate to combat that. So we have to really support these types of initiatives because all of us recognize that Canada is stronger when all of us feel that we can fully belong.
Okay, Amira El Gawabi, Canada's first special representative on combating Islamophobia. Thank you so much for joining us today, Amira.
Thanks, Faiza.